gives me great pleasure. I've gotten to know this person over the last couple of years, and during this COVID time, we really got to know each other because we were doing a lot around mental health issues, and she quickly became almost an international expert, but surely a national expert. And it's my pleasure to introduce her. And I want to thank Lumina. And where's Jasmine at? Did she leave? She went on her break, you know, but I was going to introduce our partners from Lumina here, but she'll be back soon. But Dr. Zainab Okolo is from our Lumina Foundation, and there's so much I can tell you about her. But the item I will say is she's an expert in higher education policy, as well as in student mental health. And she's done this through her institutional work and a clinical practice. Her research focuses heavily on serving the needs around equitable populations, first-generation college students, people of color, inmates, and others who have traditionally struggled to succeed in post-secondary education. Without ado, Dr. Okolo.
Well, thank you so much. All right, and shout out to the 3-minute break requester. I really appreciate that. Self-care is the first step to helping students with mental health. Let me see. Thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Thompson. See if I could work this. So good afternoon, everyone. It is truly a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you so much for the opportunity to step in and talk to you all a little bit today about higher education, our ecosystem, and the wake of our national mental health crisis. I want to thank so much Dr. Aaron Thompson and his amazing team, and also the incomparable faculty and staff here in the great the great state of Kentucky. Again, glad to be here and glad to talk on this topic. As shared, I'm currently a strategy officer with the Lumina Foundation and have been so for about 4 years. And on my team, I serve a small but mighty team led by my director, Dr. Jasmine Haywood, focusing on 4-year student success, where I shepherd a body of work specifically focused on holistic student supports, including investments that focus on student parents, shoring up advising models, and pedagogies, and also centering and supporting the cultivation of our mental health practices on campuses nationwide. Today, I'll be providing what I hope is a quick landscape overview, including how our nation is responding to pressing and increasing needs for counseling services both on and off campus, along with a high-level overview of the way the national context has impacted our sector since the wake of the pandemic. And finally, hopeful strategies for creating a more sustainable, equitable, student-centered culture within our universities that acknowledge the needs of students and their mental health. Within our equity-centered work at the Lumina Foundation and our investments, we've done our due diligence to ensure that we have an accurate capture of the current student population that we serve today. And we call them today's student. They are more diverse than ever. They themselves are parenting young children, financially independent, and more often than not, working half-time or full-time, multiple jobs, and nearly half are adult learners. And with further investigation, we also learned that within our Today's Student campaign, that today's student faces serious mental health challenges, including managing new and existing diagnoses, along with contemplating suicide, at which the national average for completed suicides on college campuses has increased significantly as of last year. Where does this leave us now? And how do we ensure that students, like today's students, overall receive the supports they need for continued success? So before I begin conversations like this, I always like to share my bias. I think it's important to share the lens that I'm using so that as I give my perspective and share what I think is best use practices, you know exactly how to scrutinize and push back on some of the things that I am suggesting may be our next steps. So as a therapist, I have been a licensed trauma-informed mental health professional for over a decade. And I know what you're thinking, how did she start at 2 years old? I spent the first decade of my career while I was practicing as a student services professional. So shout out to the academic advisors. And the first couple of years was first in admissions counseling, then as an academic advisor, then as a director of a department where I got to not only still serve students, but also ensure that our small but mighty major passed all of the accreditation audits, which of course was the most enjoyable part of my work, at least. That's what I looked forward to, not Christmas or anything, you know. And about 8 years ago, I had an experience on campus that really shifted my career path forever. At my flagship Research One State University, I just so happened to serve the major on campus that graduated a disproportionate amount of first generation students of color, student parents, student athletes. And with that, my advising style had to adapt to become more or less intrusive and holistic. My students benefited from not only having those mandatory check-ins with their academic pathways and selection of courses connected to their hopeful career paths, but they also really loved my Open Door Friday policies, where I would have a drove of students waiting in the waiting room area of my department, coming to me with a litany of things that directly impacted their academic success, but were not directly related to school. Some of these variety of life circumstances included dealing with their first breakup, mom and dad divorcing shortly after they graduated, destabilizing their sense of stability, their first real financial crisis when they went to the university day and signed up for all those credit cards that they thought meant free money, or their first brush with managing their severe depression and anxiety outside of the safety and familiarity of home. And despite many requests, I had a few students wanting to work with me directly because they knew I was a therapist. What I did instead was I tried my best to equip them with a map of resources on campus by creating my own relationships with not only the counseling center, but also other resources on campus for students that had disabilities, so that if there's any time a question that I could not answer or could not provide services for, there was a connection there. I distinctly remember one of my counseling trips, and I called one of these a counseling trips, and I only had a handful of these for an example to use, where I had a code word with my department chair that if I ever had a student in crisis, I would personally walk them to the counseling center so that they would not avoid using the resources. I know many of you, I see the head nods, you've been there, you've done that, right? I only had to use that maybe a handful of times, but on this particular trip, I had a student that was really truthfully in crisis, meaning during our advising, he revealed that he was suicide ideated with a plan. Dropped everything, put in my email, used my code with my chair, walked him to the counseling center. And let's call the student Sam. Sam went with me reluctantly, but willingly, since I was literally holding his hand across campus to the counseling center. We got him sat down, we got the paperwork filled out, turned in the student ID to prove that he was a student at the campus. And I was told that I should go ahead and leave so that they can take the supports from there. So I left, albeit very hesitant, I left. And I left with the intention and with the hope that Sam would get the resources that he needed while he was there. About less than an hour after that exchange of leaving Sam in that waiting room, I get a frantic knock from said Sam at my door. And according to Sam, after he had waited, an advisor, a counselor had come, taken him back briefly and let him know that despite his state of crisis, that he would have to sign up for the waiting list and come back in about 2 months. Yeah, to be honest, I was more than just a little bit upset and very concerned for Sam. because I was privy to the information that let me know that Sam was just not in a good place, and it was a little bit higher than just a state of emotional frenzy. And it took consistent encouragement and consistent relationship building for Sam to even get to the day that he would tell me what was going on. And I used my code word, and you messed up my code word by sending my student back across campus. And thank goodness for our relationship, he came back to the office to report. Seeing Sam with this withdrawn, hopeless look in his eyes, for me as an advisor, was absolutely crushing. Fast forward, I was able to get Sam seen by services off campus, utilizing my own network. I was able to connect with Sam's parents to kind of update them on where he was with his own mental health challenges, with Sam's permission, of course. And gratefully, due to Sam's persistence and willingness not to give up on himself, he ended up being just fine. And of course, such good work doesn't go unpunished. Soon after, I became somehow the mental health advising czar on campus, with students and other advisors sending their students to me as though they did not have the same list. But there was something about having a network off campus that would equip us to better serve our students, since we were already backed up with those 2-month wait list. And the debacle terrified me and uncovered a significant gap in what I thought was simply a gap around institutional policy. And I'm going to use this visual really quickly. Institutional policy, I'm going to go back for a second, excuse me, around institutional policy and student services. I assumed then, which was around 2014, 2016, that the 2-month wait list was just an issue on our campus. And upon a bit more digging, a bit more connecting, going to conferences, I discovered, no, that was actually the nationwide average for waitlist counseling centers across the nation during those years. Well, as of last year, the average is around 8 months. That's right, around 8 months that a student in pursuit of services, whether they are in crisis or not, to have to wait to be seen by a counselor on campus. And for many students, it's the first time they're seeking services. And for many students, it's the only place they can get utility from those free 5 to 10 services that we offer our students on campus. So keeping this in mind, let's take a closer look at our current mental health landscape. And so using AI technology, I typed in this morning an appropriate visual for the mental health landscape in higher ed, and this is what I got. Okay, so maybe I just Googled forest fires, okay? I'm kidding, I don't use ChatGPT quite yet. But take a moment to think about this analogy. When you think about a forest fire, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Perhaps fear, a sense of urgency, concerns for safety, questions around how close is it to my house specifically, and how fast is it moving towards me and everything that I'm familiar with, and who is working to put it out. Some may think, oh, it's eventually going to burn out, it's nature's way, what will last will last. But often those kinds of remarks don't come when it's happening in your state, in your neighborhood, on your campus, next door to you. In looking at the mental health crisis on campus, we should keep this visual at the forefront because it is the most accurate. We can't afford to look away. We don't have the luxury of assuming that it won't impact us. It's in our neighborhood, and left unattended, it will only grow. And this is the pandemic within the pandemic. A slow burn of challenges related to mental health on college campuses, agnostic of institutional type or location. So it is extremely exhilarating to me to hear all the work that's happening in Kentucky around this work. But again, it's agnostic of state. With this, there are seemingly new demands on both institutional capacity and responsiveness to increase student demand and need. The business model of our universities demand that we meet the needs of its consumer, the student, and overwhelmingly students are asking for a keen attention to be paid to their mental health and how it's impacting their college outcomes. According to the CDC, since the pandemic, the student mental health has taken a collective sharp turn and is trending in the wrong direction with increased depression, anxiety, and withdrawal. And although these stats are alarming, they also tell a larger story that our college campuses have and have not considered when admitting our consumer students to campuses, and that is the correlation between trauma and onset. To start, let's take the traditional college age student between the ages of around 17 to 22. During this time, students are transitioning from adolescence to early adulthood within the lifespan of human development. And a vast majority, college is the first time being away from family, the first time experiencing true independence and responsibility. And as I mentioned earlier, another first for many students is a realization of undiagnosed mental illness, especially for students who did not have access to screenings, whose behaviors were often pathologized rather than assessed, or an individual education plan or an IEP, prior to being at their institutions. However, within our new environment, with our newer stressors, mental health challenges are uncovered and triggered at a higher rate. And when this is discovered before the age of 18, it is considered early onset. Early onset provides students with a running start towards various treatment and rehabilitation options, in the best case scenario, of course. However, when symptoms are discovered within late adolescence, early adulthood, after the ages of around 18, this is often referred to as late onset. When this occurs on campus, within the first 2 years of adjusting to college, the outcomes can be devastating to students and their support networks. Moreover, late onset is often capturing deficits found, again, in inequitable access to early mental health screenings and testing, rather than an actual absence of early symptoms. And this is important because this is where we see students coming in and talking to advisors about not being able to get out of bed in the morning, engaging in really risky, I'll just call them experimental behaviors on the spectrum of that. And when we think about those behaviors, these are unfortunately the behaviors that within the media that we've glorified as part of the college experience. What we were actually witnessing were folks in the last stage of their frontal lobe development. This is where you have the best chance of changing and establishing your personality. But once this front part of your head gets hard, a hard head makes a very soft other areas. It's really hard to change. It's really hard to adapt. It's really hard to adjust. And so when we have these, and we've already done a lot of work to create a narrative around behaviors like drinking, excess spending, unsafe sexual behaviors on campus, we don't know how to decouple that from the fact that students are actually experiencing for the first time their mental health crisis. These two framings are extremely significant, particularly for students that are inheriting post-pandemic, the students, that we're inheriting post-pandemic, because they help underscore the mental health advocates and practitioners and researchers and what they meant when they said the pandemic did not create the mental health crisis, it only exacerbated a lot of the things that we were seeing. It did not only agitate some dormant symptoms and triggered others. The pandemic exposed our system as fully underprepared to respond to the need. And it has had a societal, and it has had our society and our culture that supported that lack of response through our culture around stigma. So the term mental health is often, unfortunately, only conflated with mental illness. And it has drawn to itself a stigma that is played out in how we treat people with mental illness and how we treat those that are even seeking out better ways to manage their mental health. So it's important to note that mental health encompasses our social, emotional well-being, as well as psychological wellness. The state of our mental health can determine how we relate to others and make choices overall. And like many ideals around identity, we define our mental health, the way we define our mental health can be placed on a spectrum. And for me, the spectrum is all the way from thriving to maintaining and surviving to struggling. We unfortunately have not done well enough to manage the middle balance of just managing. And that has a lot to do with the fact that we as a society like to deal in extremes. So if we see somebody doing well, we assume that they have no mental health issues. Not so. And if we see somebody struggling, we assume that they can never do well. Not so. And because we forgot to remember that, like healthcare, our mental health must be managed and considered, and can be managed and considered, we tend to live in those extremes. So yes, some of us are predisposed to certain types of mental illness, which creates additional challenges, but there is help and support for us to work towards reaching our ideal mental health state in the same way we have goals for our ideal physical health state, and to reimagine what it means to be well. When this definition becomes our new schema for how we think about and understand and engage the concept of mental health, we can clearly see that the absence of suicide and tragedy on our campuses is not the presence of mental health or a mentally healthy campus. I've had numerous conversations with leaders across the country that believe that because on their campuses specifically, they have not had to deal with suicide at the rates compared to the national average, that somehow their campus is doing well, despite the wait list, despite students, not being able to engage in services, or because their campus has yet to have a national tragedy related to gun violence. This means that their campus is exempt from doing the harder lift work of providing a space on campus that is psychologically safe enough for students to receive the care that they need. And this is all false. We are always surprised when we're watching the news and these tragedies strike, but that's mainly because there was no pre-work to do anything preventative. And oftentimes we are in response to a crisis on campus. And prior to the pandemic, we lived in this space pretty comfortably. Given that mental health is now center stage and we have an opportunity to reimagine the space, let's take a look at some of the data and what it's been telling us for a while. It could almost feel like we are only just discovering some of these things, but we're not. There has been data gratefully being collected by scholars and researchers to help capture this for those that were really trying to sound the alarm years before the pandemic. According to NASPA, 34% of students received mental health treatment in 2017, up from 19% 10 years prior to in 2007. The CDC notified us that in 2019, 20% of students had previous diagnoses of depression. That was up from 9% in 2009. And according to the Association for University and College Counseling Center Directors, 90% of campus counseling center directors in 2019 reported a steadily increasing demand from the previous 5 years. And of course, we could think about what was happening situationally in our larger society, in our larger world at those times, in those decades. For example, the recessions, the different impacts of war, both at home and abroad, the quiet but steady rise of social and civil unrest as our political parties were changing. Those things all have a direct impact, and we're probably seeing that. But of course, now shortly after the pandemic, we quickly saw an uptick across a couple of different factors. We quickly see an uptick in the challenges on our college campuses, an increased suicides, a significant number of students reporting that they had challenges with depression. And by the fall of 2021, we then had an enrollment crisis on our hands. Students quickly deciding that college was no longer a priority for them, and that the value proposition of college had to be questioned against the backlog of how well they were feeling and engaging of even attending a college at the time. And in the wake of this enrollment plunge, in partnership with Gallup, Lumina released the 2022 State of Higher Education report. The State of Higher Education report, authored by my colleague, Courtney Brown, highlighted this exact tension. So think about this. The report showed that 76% of college students surveyed indicated they considered stopping out of college due to mental health related emotional stress. Now, this is a sharp 34% increase from the last report that we released, which was in 2020, and arguably placing mental health as the #1 reason for students to drop out. And taking a bit of a closer look at our actual question and instrument, the question specifically posed was, which of the following describes why you considered stopping out of coursework? And as you can see, we had a litany of things that students could select from in rank order. And on top of all of the things, in comparison to everything else on that list, and I'll give you guys a quick second to kind of take a look, that included other things like job loss, food insecurity, housing insecurity, thinking your education quality was low, COVID-19 itself, and we were surveying in the midst of a pandemic. That was not enough or high enough of a concern than mental health related emotional stress. And as we continue to take a closer look, the question specifically posed to students did not discriminate across ethnicities. We broke it down to see, okay, were there certain folks from certain cultures doing better than, nope, everybody across the board decided that this was the thing that would stop them from going to school in that order. And that, I think, is really important because representation matters, and understanding how we think collectively. And we don't always get impacted by things collectively in the same way, but in this way, we were. And that in the long term, our completion rates would also then be impacted. Also, from our report, we made sure to look at our 6-year completion rates, which unfortunately told a longer story about deficit across representative groups. And also looking at completion, we had a lot more work to do now that we knew that we had a crisis on our hands. So remembering our visual, the question then becomes, who exactly is responsible for stopping or at least slowing these trends down? And how do we approach this now that in some ways mental health has caused students to question the value of higher education overall? Let's pivot a bit to thinking about what we do have and what roles we can take advantage of while we're doing this work. To address the mental health crisis, there needs to be an all hands on deck approach, and that includes policy leaders, mental health practitioners, advocacy orgs, online vendors, faculty and staff, and even students. We fortunately have an extremely engaged policy front now, finally. Everyone from the US Secretary of Education, Secretary Miguel Cardona, to the US Department of Education releasing a recent report encouraging us to use Higher Education Relief Fund Act funding towards mental health on campus, to the US Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, using and causing mental health and specifically student loneliness and sense of belonging to be his main platform, where he's teaching across the nation how quickly linked longer term health outcomes are to mental health, and getting us around the language that mental health is in fact health. And of course, we have amazing proactive leaders like Dr. Aaron Thompson and his team that have kind of seen and pioneered this work way before the pandemic to help lead the charge around student mental health and wellness and behavioral health as a key budgetary priority within state strategic plans. We are finally primed for change, and with higher education being a very slow changing organism, this is the time for us to lean into that opportunity. But I do want to take a moment to acknowledge our faculty, our staff that have remained at the front lines of the work of this important issue, which a lot of times has been a very thankless process, and will continue to be the frontline workers of engagement, even when we do establish some more standardized ways of taking care and establishing care with students on campus. Thank you for those investments. I also want to make the note that as you take care of students, remembering to prioritize and take care of yourself. And there's such an important work to be done around ensuring that faculty have the clearance to let go of the stigma for themselves. I think I was watching the news the other day where a politician kind of took back to take care of depression. And I think oftentimes about faculty, many of my friends who are faculty that are struggling with depression themselves. I think my running joke that's actually not that funny is that when we were all going through the pandemic, faculty and staff were not collected together and put on planet no pandemic. You were at home raising your families, taking care of your children, taking care of your aging parents. So thinking about ways that our space and our ecosystem can fully destigmatize mental health so that everybody feels ready and supported to engage in the supports that they need. In terms of organizations, there are several at the forefront leading on this work, creating campus frameworks, including the Steve Fund, of which Lumina has a partnership with, JED Foundation. Many campuses are JED Foundation campuses where they have frameworks to not only train faculty on how to respond or be first responders to students, but also equip students for having their own mental health groups on campus to support one another, and others that are producing relevant and actionable data. The oldest data set that we have on mental health in students is held by the Healthy Mind Study, and it's only about 25 years old. So there's a lot more work for us to do in that space as well, but these are some of the key actors that have been leading the work in that way. And when we think about having meaningful conversations about mental health on campus, particularly around solutions, we have to do so by not only calling out the challenge, but also leaning into the hope of what we can do with our responsibility, with our networks, with partners across our different stakeholders. I believe it's important to start by a strategic and intentional destigmatization around mental health. And this can only be done through education, the laying out of the challenge overall, the upgrading of our lexicon when it comes to what we're seeing on how students are engaging with this, by equipping us with that new language, and then moving into solutions. So here is my really pretty slide of 5 priority strategies that I think that would allow us to kind of start this conversation. And I'm so glad to see what I saw earlier with that swirl. Obviously, I'm clearly in the right state, so I feel a little bit like I'm preaching to the choir, so please bear with me. This includes partnership, access, training, evaluation, and of course, equity. First, when I think about partnership, I'm talking about ensuring that we make sure that our ecosystem becomes even smaller and smaller through the creation of both systems on and off campus. And this looks like both for faculty and staff to have their own coalitions, not only on how to support and identify challenges among students, but also to support and identify challenges amongst yourselves. And in doing so, in equipping faculty and equipping staff, ensuring that there's a way for us to translate some of that into some type of credential training. So I'm sure you all have heard about other opportunities to connect this way. There are mental health first aid programs, but kind of spreading that a little bit further and creating the relationships that would help sustain that on every campus. Additionally, beyond connecting with advocacy orgs like the few that I mentioned that were on the last slide, like the Steve Foundation, the Steve Fund, JED Foundation, thinking about licensing boards and creating ways to triage off campus. So what happens when even, let's take UK, when you triage a student, you discover they don't necessarily need that longer form counseling. What if the coin is flipped? What if you find that they actually need institutional help almost immediately? How do we connect? What are our relationships with the inpatient clinics right within our own city, right? What are our relationships with licensing boards so that we are able to fill in the counseling needs on our campuses? These are things that are necessary to have and relationships that are necessary to build so that we're no longer working around this work in a silo formation. Next is access and focusing on the road to destigmatizing mental health services, just ensuring that resources are available both in person and online that would allow us to respond to the demand. And this might look like reimagining and expanding emergency hotlines. We have our mental health hotline now that's nationwide, but also creating something like a network, a code network right on your campus is extremely important. And also possibly engaging some of those online platforms, some that come to mind that are pretty popular, but I'm not this is not an endorsement. I'm thinking about Better Health, Psych Today, Timely MD. Those are folks that are still building around the need. And those are not things that we can necessarily turn our nose up to, because again, the demand is a lot higher than what an in-person service model would be able to achieve. But creating a mentally healthy campus would mean that whether you're engaging in person or online, there's no stigma with how you engage that work, and that access to such resources would not be then later punished. So I'm thinking about students that need to take time off from being on campus for a long mental health illness and things like that. Those are conversations that access would allow us to address. Next, I'm going to circle back to training, and it's probably one of the most important steps on our within our campus systems and directly on our campuses. When we think about our mental health goals across the nation, the first thing that we need to think about is equipping us with the right language so that we know what we're looking at when we see it, and that it's not just in seeing the extremes of a student acting out on campus or putting other folks or themselves into danger, but what does it look like in conversation? What does it look like even when you have a student withdraw from your class or turning in assignments? How do you determine if this is something that needs to be taken up to additional supports? This also challenges our system to think a little bit more about evaluation services. Would it be helpful for us to have students be evaluated at freshman year in an opt-out service, where here we're not looking to spread your information, this is personal data under FERPA, but we would like to let you know that we have a way of having you have these evaluation tools so that we can connect you to services, and being proactive around getting students connected early. And then I think about evaluation. And for me, this is the clearest and most important research development that will come in the next probably 3 to 5 years that will help us to evaluate some of the great ideas that institutions and systems and states have put into place. As of last year, particularly looking back at the tech boom, within the mental health tech boom, it boomed to about 5 billion with a B, with a man, I picked the wrong path, right? So there was an opportunity there because higher ed was still trying to decide if we had stigma around this and whose responsibility was it anyway. And we just need our students to come back to school. And if they could just come back to campus, they'll be normal. And in doing some of that, we found that we needed to rely on folks outside of us to assess the problem and to offer solutions. And so here we are with tons of different solutions across the nation, but no real entity to really evaluate whether or not the solution is hitting our bottom line, is causing students to be retained at higher rates, persist, engage the resources for longer than just a semester, and actually getting them to get the supports that they need around their mental health challenges. So evaluation data is going to be really key in the next coming years. And then finally, equity. And when I think about equity, I specifically think about racial equity when it comes to mental health. At Lumina, it is our view that racial equity is achieved when a person's life outcomes can no longer be predicted by their race or ethnic background. And in relationship to mental health, we know that students are much less likely to seek out services due to lack of representation within services. So representation, again, is key to ensuring that students are served equitably, and that includes creating opportunities to engage and hear from a variety of student perspectives, and then translating those requests and translating those needs into actionable steps, which includes ensuring that as we think about building out our counseling centers, that we put diversity at the forefront of our thinking. And while those are my 5 foundational areas of shifting change, the reality is, as Dr. Thompson mentioned earlier, this is a very complex web and a very complex challenge that we're dealing with. I wish that I could say that putting all those 5 into place would eradicate us of all of the different things that are being directly impacted as a result of the national mental health crisis. But honestly, there's a few more things. Like looking at K-12 data, for example, thinking about the students that we're inheriting, I believe it'll be this fall year that we will finally have that full freshman class who were just sophomores or ninth graders. Okay, I see some head nods, so I'm on track. Ninth graders, right when the pandemic hit, and now they will be coming to your campus, full-time students, but developmentally, they might still be 15. I don't know. We'll see. Because a lot of that sharp human development, particularly at those last stages of high school, is important because a lot of the development happens within the social emotional realm. And a lot of them were in their rooms, cameras off, on Zoom, trying to learn. And so we have to think about the ways that isolation has impacted, and we can only do that by looking at what the data from K-12 has told us. So this might be the final bridge that gets us to kind of talk across these sectors. Another area is just engaging with media coverage. So making sure that as we implement things, a lot of our systems don't want to touch this because of fear of repercussion, punishment for doing good work. What happens if we implement this and we create a larger need and a larger demand that we don't have the finances to sustain? And instead of thinking that way, thinking about ways to partner with media so that we have a narrative that allows us to continue to move towards destigmatization. That is the word of the day. If nothing else you remember my blue suit, and remember no more stigma around mental health, right? So those are things that we have to think about. I also want to point to change agent engagement. So just because of the generation of influencers that we're living in, we're finding that a lot of this conversation moves further faster when students can see folks representing themselves, promoting this work. And a lot of folks have already gotten that. So the White House already had a mental health convening that I think engaged Selena Gomez a couple of years ago that directly talked about not only the importance of mental health being part of self-care, but continuing that even while students are on campus. And these are things that really do matter. And so, yes, the fire is now down. And just want to end with saying that there is hope. Under all the fire and urgency and crisis talk, there is hope. As both a trauma-informed therapist that has witnessed people make complete 360 turns around what was once crippling mental illness to being equipped, to acknowledging where they were and getting right back on life's paths, I look at this and my lens is to look at this system issue in the very same way. That although that there is urgency and there are things that have triggered us into this position, there are also flourishing factors. And we have an opportunity to make a great shift within our larger network. And creating a mentally healthy campus and ecosystem really just means ensuring that students are not just ignored with their challenges and are not just encouraged to thrive by forcing them into survival, which is fight or flight mode, but instead are welcomed onto campus and are brought into a community where they're encouraged to manage their mental health and to engage with services that would help them directly. So as my summative takeaway, there's hope, there's lessons in this crisis too. There's an opportunity to move away from fight or flight, and there's an opportunity to ensure that our students continue to thrive on our campus. Thank you so much for this time, and thank you for the rest of the conference as well.